Good morning, friends. In this connection, I was given by well-wishers an intact copy of the collection of speeches for the prosecution delivered by that fierce revolutionary, the first People's Commissar of Military Affairs in the Workers' and Peasants' Government, the Commander-in-Chief, and later the organizer of the Department of Exceptional Courts of the People's Commissariat of Justice, where the personal rank of tribune was being readied for him until Lenin vetoed the title. The glorious accuser in the greatest trials subsequently exposed as the ferocious enemy of the people, N.V. Krylenko. And if despite everything we want to attempt a brief review of the public trials, if we are determined to try to get a feeling for the judicial atmosphere of the first post-revolutionary years, then we have to learn to read this Krylenko text. We have no other. And using it as a basis, we must try to picture to ourselves everything that is missing from it, and everything that happened in the provinces too. Of course, we would prefer to see the stenographic record of those trials, to listen to the dramatic voices from beyond the grave of those first defendants and those first lawyers, speaking at a time when no one could have foreseen in what implacable sequence all of it would be swallowed up, together with those Rev Tribunal members as well. However, as Krylenko has explained, for a whole series of technical reasons it was inconvenient to publish the stenographic records. It was convenient only to publish his speeches for the prosecution and the sentences handed down by the tribunals, which by that time had already come to jibe completely with the demands of the accuser-prosecutor. Krylenko claims that the archives of the Moscow Rev Tribunal and the Supreme Rev Tribunal turned out by 1922 to be far more orderly. In a whole series of cases the stenographic records were so incomprehensible that it was necessary either to cross out entire pages or else to try to restore the text from memory. In a series of the biggest trials, including the trial which followed the revolt of the left SRs and the case of Admiral Shastny, were conducted entirely without stenographic records. This is strange. The condemnation of the left SRs was not a trivial matter. It was after the February and October revolutions, the third turning point in our history, signaling the transition to a one-party system in the state. Not a few of them were shot, and no stenographic record was made. And the military plot of 1919 was liquidated by the Cheka in an extrajudicial reprisal, which was further proof of its existence. In this case, more than 1,000 people were arrested altogether, and really, how could trials have been set up for them all? So just try to produce a neat, orderly report on the trials of those years. Nevertheless, we can learn the important principles involved in them. For example, the Supreme Accuser, in other words, the Prosecutor General, informs us that the All-Russian Central Executive Committee had the right to intervene in any judicial proceeding. VTSIK pardons and punishes at its own discretion without any limitation whatever. For example, the 6-month sentence was changed to 10 A 6-month sentence was changed to 10 years, and as the reader understands, it is necessary for the entire All-Russian Central Executive Committee to assemble at a plenary meeting to this end, since its chairman, Sverdlov, for example, could correct a sentence without leaving his office. All of this, Krylenko explains, shows the superiority of our system over the false theory of the separation of powers, that is, the theory of the independence of the judiciary. True, Sverdlov also said, it is very good that the legislative and executive power are not divided by a thick wall as they are in the West. All problems can be decided quickly, especially on the phone. Krylenko formulated even more frankly and precisely the general tasks of the Soviet courts in his speeches before those tribunals, when the court was at one and the same time both the creator of the law, Krylenko's italics, and a political weapon, my italics. Creator of the law because for 4 years there were no codes. They had thrown out the Tsarist codes and they had not composed their own. Don't tell me our criminal courts ought to act exclusively on the basis of existing written norms. We live in the process of revolution. A tribunal is not the kind of court in which fine points of jurisprudence and clever stratagems are to be restored. We are creating a new law and new ethical norms. And also, no matter how much is said here about the eternal law of truth, justice, etc., we know how dearly these have cost us. But if your prison terms are compared with ours, maybe it didn't cost you so dearly after all. Maybe eternal justice was somewhat more comfortable. The reason that fine points of jurisprudence are unnecessary is that there is no need to clarify whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. The concept of guilt is an old bourgeois concept which has now been uprooted. And so we heard that Comrade Krylenko that a tribunal was not that kind of court. On another occasion, we would hear from him that a tribunal was not a court at all. A tribunal is an organ of the class struggle of the workers directed against their enemies, and must act from the point of view of the interests of the revolution, having in mind the most desirable results for the masses of workers and peasants. People are not people, but carriers of specific ideas, no matter what the individual qualifies. No matter what the individual qualities of the defendant, only one method of evaluating him is to be applied: evaluation from the point of view of class expediency. In other words, you can exist only if it's expedient for the working class. And if this expediency should require that the avenging sword should fall on the head of the defendants, then no verbal arguments can help, such as arguments by lawyers, etc. In our revolutionary court, we are guided not by articles of the law, and not by the degree of extenuating circumstances. In the tribunal, we must proceed on the basis of considerations of expediency. That was the way it was in those years. People lived and breathed, and then suddenly found out that their existence was inexpedient. And it must also be kept in mind that it was not what he had done that constituted the defendant's burden, but what he might do if he were not shot now. We protect ourselves not only against the past, but also against the future. Comrade Krylenko's pronouncements are clear and all-inclusive. They bring alive for us that whole period of law in sharp relief. The clarity of autumn suddenly pierces the mists of spring and reaches us. And it is perhaps unnecessary to go further. Perhaps we aren't required to page through trial after trial. These pronouncements will be henceforth inexorably applied. Close your eyes tight for a minute and picture a tiny courtroom, not yet gilded, earnest members of the tribunal in simple field jackets, lean, not yet fat-faced. The accusing power, as Krylenko loved to style himself, wears an unbuttoned civilian jacket with a glimpse of a sailor's striped undershirt just visible at the open throat. The supreme accuser expresses himself in this sort of language: "The question of fact is interesting to me. Define concretely the aspect of the tendency. We are operating on the plane of analysis of objective truth." Sometimes, as you read, a quotation from the Latin shines out. It is true that the same quotations turn up in case after case, but after several years a different one does appear. And no wonder. He did, after all, complete the course in 2 faculties despite all his revolutionary running around. What attracts one to him are his frank opinions about the defendants, professional scoundrels. And he isn't hypocritical in the least. If he didn't like the defendant's smile, he doesn't hesitate to blurt out a threat, even before any sentence is imposed. And as for you and your smile, Citizeness Ivanova, we'll make you pay for it, and we'll find a way to fix it so that you never laugh again. So shall we begin? A. The case of Ruski Vedomosti. In this case, one of the earliest free speech was on trial. In March 24th, 1918, this famous professorial newspaper published an article by Savinkov entitled "En route." They would have much preferred to arrest Savinkov himself, but he really was en route, damn it, and where was he to be found? So instead they closed down the paper and brought that elderly editor, P.V. Yegorov, to court as a defendant, insisting that he explain how he had dared publish the article. After all, the new era was 4 months old, and it was time to get used to it. Yegorov naively defended himself by saying that the article had been written by a leading political figure whose opinion was of general interest, whether or not the editor shared it. Furthermore, he saw nothing slanderous in Savinkov's having said, "Let us not forget that Lenin, Natanson, and co. arrived in Russia via Berlin," i.e. that the German authorities helped them return to the homeland, because that in actual fact was what had happened. Kaiser Wilhelm's embattled Germany had helped Comrade Lenin to return. Krylenko retorted that he would not conduct a prosecution for slander. Why not? and that the newspaper was on trial for attempting to influence people's minds. And how could any newspaper dare have such a purpose? The formal charge did not include Savinkov's phrase, "One has to be criminally insane to affirm seriously that the international proletariat will come to our aid," because it still would come to our aid. For attempting to influence people's minds, the newspaper, which had been published since 1864 and had survived the most fiercely reactionary periods, those of Loris Melikov, Pobedonostsev, Stolypin, Caso, and all the rest, was ordered closed down forever, and Yegorov, the editor, and this is a shameful thing to have to say, was given only 3 months of solitary, just as though we were in Greece or some such place. It is not so shamefully lenient, however, if one stops to think that it was only 1918, and if the old man managed to survive, he would be imprisoned again and many more times too. It may seem strange to us now, but it is a fact that in those thunderous years bribes were given and taken just as tenderly as they had been from time immemorial in old Russia, and as they will be in the Soviet Union from here to eternity. Bribery was particularly rife in the judicial organs, and though we blush to say it, in the Cheka. The official histories in their red, gold-stamped bindings are silent about this, but the old folks and the eyewitnesses remember that the fate of political prisoners in the first years of the revolution, as distant from Stalinist times, often depended on bribes. They were accepted uninhibitedly, and prisoners were honestly released as a result. Although Krylenko picked out only a dozen cases for the 5-year period his book covers, he reports 2 cases of bribery. Alas, even the Moscow Tribunal and the Supreme Tribunal squeezed their way through to perfection along a crooked path, muddied themselves in improprieties. Have a good day, friends.